thanks very much for being here, for joining us for our Monday morning little nugget on bias and the impact it has on boardroom and team effectiveness. This whole area of bias is actually quite a big topic. So I've broken it down into 3 different nuggets over this week and the next 2 weeks so that we can get a good handle on some of the content. For those that are new to the group, I am Sharon Constançon. I'm chairman of the South African, I am, but not in this context. In this context, I'm CEO of Genius Boards and Genius Methods, and this is an event being put on by Genius Methods, and we reach out to all the various populations that I know because this topic obviously is very generic. It's also for the professional forum of the SACC as well. So we do have people from various ways of knowing me who've come to join us. But our objective today is to understand how decision-making can be undone and not be very effective in a boardroom environment. So without any further ado, can I just ask that stay on mute, which you all are. Thank you very much, most appreciated. What I would like is if you have any questions, please could you place those in the chat box. I will pick them up after we've been through the initial session. So I'll chat initially for 15, 20 minutes max, and then we'll have question time and I'll pick up your Q&A, your Q&A from what is going to be available in the chat box to me. So thanks very much, everybody. Right, first is bias and influence on effective board outcomes, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Most important thing to bear in mind is we are all human. Therefore, we are easily influenced, and that is a fact. We are biased, that is a fact. Fair enough, we like to have our own way as well. We are also a function of all the experience and learnings that we've been through. So we only can respond to things we have seen before, we've learned about, we've managed to think through our learnings and our experiences. But also one of the interesting things that's been stated by many theorists is that as humans, we like to complicate things. So that doesn't help us in the whole decision-making process of what we're going through if we end up with things becoming more and more complex. So the thing I'd like to just mention here is when we say we are influenced, money influences us, time, information, knowledge, outcomes. If something is going to be a good outcome, it's so much easier to be positive and to take that in a positive sense. It's so much more difficult if the outcome is going to be negative to make those kind of decisions, for example. It's also very difficult to make the difficult decision, the ones that involve people and sensitivities, which we have talked about in one of our earlier sessions. And one of the statements that was made by an academic, which is pretty obvious, it says that people are always the reason for companies failing. But my point is, companies are also a function of people because they wouldn't exist if people didn't put them together. So I'm not so sure I really go with that statement, but anyway, it's there and it has been stated. But it is important for us to understand the impact we all have in this process of decision making. The important part we need to recognize is at what stages the influences come in. And the important part, once we understand that, is how do we then mitigate those at a company level and make sure that those things are not impacting the way the decision-making process is evolving. So one of the statements made, one of the academic statements is, it's far less a process underpinned by pure logical analysis. It's rather, this is decision-making, is a distinctly human activity that can be inherently, but also predictably flawed. So this is academic research that is coming with this as an outcome. So it's quite important for us to actually then think this one through and understand as boards, how we are going to protect the company from falling into these bad decisions. Now, we used BP as an example a little earlier in one of our sessions, where we talked about the visibility when people looked backwards that a crisis was likely to occur. In their decision-making process going forwards at any point in time, there was no mitigating processes in place to stop them looking at the wrong metrics and thus ending up with a risk to the decisions that they were taking, were risking the business as a whole because they were focused on one specific area. So a lot of things around these kind of mitigations is, why are we going along with groupthink? Why are we going along a certain path? Who's prepared to put their hand up and say, I'm not sure that's the right thing for us to be doing? To actually be the Jiminy Cricket on somebody's shoulder and say, why are we doing that? So boards need to be aware of it. They need to put in their plans. And in next week, we'll actually go through some of those toolkits that boards can use to protect themselves against these risks that are causing them the wrong outcomes. We won't be going through all the toolkits today. We'll just be setting the scene, and we'll follow that next week. There are a variety of things that can influence and bias us. They can be grouped into those that impact the individual, but also there are biases that impact the whole as well. There's group biases that are going to be influenced. Session 3, we're going to have a look at the main biases that we are impacted on in a business environment. There are 180 declared biases, and I found one or two others when I was thinking about it. I can't believe I found one that's not on that list. But there are a lot of biases. Some of them are in groups fairly common, and they fit into 4 different quadrants, which we will go through in more detail in 2 weeks' time. So the Chartered Governance Institute, in their 2018 document they did on board guidance on board effectiveness, they were obviously looking back to things that are fitting within our code, and therefore how important this is to us. And their statements there were, well-informed and high-quality decision-making does not happen by accident. So here's another reference point coming from our regulatory guidance, actually giving us the heads up as a board to be careful. This is not that easy. It's easily a trap that we can fall into. That there are many factors that lead to poor decisions that are predictable and preventable. So again, making reference to the fact is, we know it can go wrong, so there's no more excuses anymore. To minimize that risk, to invest time and to look at their processes and procedures. Now, you don't want to go through a laborious process every time there's decisions to be made, but you need, as individuals and as groups, to have little points, trip-up points almost, to stop you and make you think, am I being biased? Is this groupthink? Am I taking the easy route out? Am I not thinking through all the options, which I should actually be doing? The other aspect we would look at is making sure we've got enough external input. Just because we've got all the knowledge doesn't mean that all our knowledge is the right knowledge. We might need actually some external knowledge, some expertise to be brought to the room. And quite often as boards, we think we know everything, and we are not readily available and open to bringing in additional advice. And sometimes you don't do it because it's money. Sometimes it's too much like hard work. It's got to be organized, it's structured, it takes time, it takes effort. But actually, sometimes just one statement from an expert, 15 minutes of their time, could save a fortune if it's done the right way. So please bear that in mind. It's something we so readily don't do in a board environment. One of the theories is around the 3 gears model. To get to decision making, you start with monitoring and mentoring. You then get to strategizing. And the third cog in this model is decision making. So here we're looking at the integration of cohesion, challenge, the board, people, decisions, and ending up ultimately with board decision making. But I'll show you this one because it's one of those key decision making comes into a lot of the models of board effectiveness. And this is one of the board effectiveness models. One of the statements which I think is a very, very valid statement. One of the most important activities a board can do is to make the right decisions. If you're making the right decisions as a board, you're ultimately going to be effective overall. You're never going to be right all the time, but it's ultimately very, very critical that you're making the right decisions for the right reasons at the right time, setting the right focus, aligning it to strategy, and getting the buy-in of all the relevant people within the organization at the same time. The problem you've got with decision making is not something you do while you're thinking, doing something else, or while you're on your own and strategizing with yourself. You can debate and think and pre-think and consider, but this is a group decision. And the difficulty you've got is people are not in the same place at a group level. They're all over the place, and they all have very, very different views and agendas and influences and bias and knowledge and experience and IQ and EQ. So we can go on to that huge number of things that are influencing those 7 to 10 people in the room that are responsible for making the right decision. And quite often, the individual players, if not alerted to this fact of what we're talking about now, will make some of the wrong decisions. And if I think back on some of my board days that I've worked in, if I'd known some of the things I know about boardroom dynamics and boardroom decision making now, I could actually pick up some of the key things that we as a board, because we didn't know any better, not because we were being destructive, were not getting to the right process of decision making. And we were jumping to the end and then justifying it backwards, which is probably one of the most common things you see in boards, where they're actually not looking forwards. They think, okay, sometimes you've got to look at all the individual steps before you are comfortable you've got to the right decision. It's a journey. It's not a leapfrog, getting there and then trying to justify why you got to that answer, which is unfortunately what does happen a lot of times. In behavioral economics, which is a science that sort of became quite popular over the decades, and particularly around the time that we came across in the business world here in the UK and in London, was when the FSA broke into the FCA and the PRA, and conduct and care of the customer became ultimately the focus of the FCA. And they brought in the whole science of behavioral economics, where marketeers have used this all this time to sell you things that you weren't planning on buying. Now they were saying you could not use behavioral economics to take advantage of the customer and get them to do things that they might not otherwise have chosen to do. So it came into business play quite strongly at that point in time. And here the statement is that decisions are impacted by individual psychology, but also by social dynamics. So it's us as an individual, but also how do we fit into our social environment? What will people think? How are people thinking? How are we talking about this thing together? And things that we are looking at as individuals, if we're confident about something at a certain point in time, or we have certainty of our facts, we are so much better at stating our case than if we're at all uncertain of anything at a point in time. Also, the more we know about it, the better IQ we have on the topic, the more we might be of a fast-thinking mind, we can get there at different speeds to somebody who might be more reflective of thought. It also says, how important is this to us? How important is it that we get to the answer we want? What is the quality of the information we have? And I think one of the key business traits we all need to make sure that we do, and we do honestly, is if we don't know something, we don't have all the knowledge, is to ensure that we're absolutely clear about that. So going into a decision-making process when you're lacking some of the knowledge, actually is quite important that you don't just go along with the group think and with the rest of the team because you don't know what's going on, you don't have a better answer. And what they're saying is a good process and bad process doesn't deliver, therefore, bad outcomes or good outcomes. It's the bunch of people in the middle that could end up with any of those outcomes, even when you have good process. So please beware. Us humans do like to complicate things. We don't always get to the right answer just because we have the right process. So for all the tools that we will learn and all the tips of the trade that we're going to learn, it still doesn't mean that we're going to get to the right answer unless we as a team work together effectively all the time. The looking at what are the things that are likely to derail good decision making and bring in the influence of bias in one way or another. And one of the things that they identify is different personalities. And if you look at certain personality traits, can become more at risk in an environment of getting to the wrong decision. So if you're looking at, and let's say it's the CEO, it could be the CFO trying to convince around or an investment manager, it could be any role, but a high degree of charisma, being an expert in the field, very IQ-led debate, who gets there with a lot of speed, controlling the environment, controlling the conversation, that kind of character is more likely to create an environment of a bad decision being made because they are ramrolling it through, and it's all around their confidence and their character we talked about a while ago. Doesn't necessarily mean it's right. And some studies have been done that people that have greater humility are prepared to work in greater collaboration, have much higher empathy, they deploy their EQ, they listen to the people around them, they listen to all the varied information and pull together a collective consideration of it. Now, I don't know if one can do a correlation because I've not done it, but if you look at the way different governments have handled the COVID environment, could we say those that have come out with a better country outcome have had more humility, collaboration, and empathy and listening versus the other group? I think it might be an interesting exercise, but I have not put aside the time to do that exercise. But I know there's been a lot of theories around the female leaders have actually led their countries through COVID in a better way. Now, there is a Brexit style percentage, 48-52, between male, female being more EQ, IQ related. So men, you do have a lot of EQ. Women tend to just have a bit more EQ than men do as an average, if we look at it. But it's a bit like a Brexit vote. So it's not really here or there. It's 48 to 52% range between the two. So we cannot state that it's women leaders that have done it better, but have the women leaders deployed humility, collaboration, and empathy and listening better than the others might have done? I have no idea, but it's worth a conversation. We can maybe pick it up later on. One of the things that I want to just go through is the two different thinking styles. And I think we did pick this up very briefly in a previous conversation. System one thinking is your intuitive thinking, where you instinctively know what the answer is. You instinctively jump to the conclusion. Very fast thinking, very emotively and emotionally driven, low on effort to achieve it, to achieve the decision. It's automatic, sometimes even automatic, like doing the housework, or I'm going to go pick something up, you know which way to go and how to get there. It's almost unconscious. You just get on and do some of these things. Now, in your everyday chores and interactions, it's absolutely fine for it to happen in that way. But thinking on your feet in a business environment can be very positive. It equally can leave everyone else behind. So it's working out, how do you balance that with everybody else? The rushing to a conclusion doesn't necessarily give you the right outcome. Very energy efficient. It has a lot of cognitive bias risk attached to fast thinking because you are ticking the boxes and assuming certain things which you actually might not have thought through, that given it some thought might think differently. So if you compare that against the system two thinking, which is very reflective, and we talked before against different professions that can sometimes give you some themes as to how people work. Slow thinking, it's effortful, it's very conscious, you're thinking it through, you're discussing it, you're debating it, and it's very deliberate. So it's very positive to have both a slow thinking and fast thinking mix in the team, provided neither are sort of derailing getting to the decision or getting to an outcome or getting to the consideration. So the importance of this is somebody who has the ability to write down the pros, write down the cons, thinking them through, weighting them, sometimes go to the nth degree, but that balance can sometimes be quite helpful to a fast thinking individual. The problem you sometimes get with slow thinking is they debate it to the point of death, go around in this ever diminishing circle and lose complete clarity on it. So there's positives and negatives to both thinking styles. So that's why you need them both to play off each other and to have that proper debate. This takes up a lot of energy, and if you get a number of people in the room that are all slow thinking, it can be a very tedious task where everybody thinks theirs is right and it's slow and we don't get anywhere. And somehow you've got to get yourself out of that space. So having a faster thinking person in the team is also extremely important. These things, the slow thinking one is very important when you have got a big decision in question. It's an investment decision. You've thought of all the things beforehand. You've got to put yourself as a company at the end of the process. If I look back, what would it look like? How would my grandmother feel now that I've told her what I've done? So making sure you've looked at everything from every angle before, during, and after. And I think in my Forex world, we always look at something, we unpick it. So we know what will it do at the beginning, what will it do if A, B, or C happen in the middle, and what would happen if A, B, or C happened at the end. So it's making sure you look at everything from all angles and making sure that you are not going to get caught out in any way. Now, I talked about the future sessions that we will cover. We'll look at the tools of how we can now stop ourselves and use the handbrake and make sure that we are not going to make the wrong decisions as a group or as an individual. And then we're going to have a look at the Cognitive Bias Codex. Those are the 180 of them are all built into there. We're not going to go through 180, but there are some key ones that we tend to come across in the business world and in our personal worlds. That are the ones that we will look at. But the most important one is the metacognitive bias, which is the one that believes we don't have any bias. So those of you who think you're above bias, you are suffering metacognitive bias because statistically, apparently, we are all biased. And it's making sure we use our own handbrakes to recognize it. And the first handbrake is the metacognitive bias. So we'll all remember that one forever. So being human is normal. Recognizing that is what makes us good leaders and good team members of boards and team engagement, so that as a management team or as a family or as a board, that we are making the right decisions. So that's my little speech, my bit on laying down the bits and sort of the preemptive theory around bias. What we'll then be looking at is, so how do we stop it and what are they? So the chat room is where I'd love you guys to put some questions, which I see a few of them are coming up already, which will be fantastic. Let's see how we go. Peter Jordan says, I kindly disagree with these. Peter Jordan, I'll just see if there's anything further on. Okay, starting assumptions. This is not the rule at all. My first slide, saying we're human. I assume that's the one you're making reference to. Right, okay. From the point of view of saying we disagree with that, Peter, obviously, I don't know exactly what point it is that you are disagreeing with, and happy if you want to put something into the chat line. But our instinctive human traits are these, I understand. Now, the importance of being a good business individual is to ensure that these tendencies are not what we're impacted by. But I'll see, Peter John, if I can see if there's anything else. I might pick that up with us a little bit later. I see a couple of other questions I'd like to get to. An example of a metaphysical system that is not biased. What sort of world would it be? Example of a metaphysical system that is not biased. So are you... do I understand, therefore, that you're saying we are all biased? And if so, I think we are agreeing with each other, or am I missing your point somewhere? You're saying here, if we're all biased, what would a world be without bias, I think we're all agreeing that bias is present. It can be extremely valuable, but equally it can get us to reach the inappropriate outcomes if we haven't considered them correctly. So it's not that they are bad things. It's a bias can have a derailing impact if we allow ourselves to react to bias rather than to respond to bias. And I think that's quite important if we are if I take an example, in the financial services sector, at one point, an organization was sending out insurance policies, and they were trying to determine a way of improving their open rate of the envelopes. So they then decided to handwrite the envelopes on a non-white business-looking envelope style, and their open rate tripled or some magical number. Increase the open rate of those envelopes as a result of what they had done, which was to influence the recipient in a way the recipient wasn't aware they were being influenced. And the FCA came down on them very harshly in terms of saying that is inappropriate to the customer because you're influencing the customer without them being able to control the influence that you're putting upon them. So that's the bit of the behavioral economics and how the FCA brought that in back up as about 2010 that particular occasion occurred. We've got some examples of Marks and Spencer's where they have also used bias. If you look at in marketing environment, retail stores, they talk about what's at the bottom of the shelf, what's at the top of the shelf, what's at eye level, and people will pay more for having the middle level, which is in line with your eyes, because just that physical presence has an influence on the receiver. So we are being influenced by color, we're influenced by noise, we're influenced by those kind of environments just within a shopping environment, not even in a business environment. And some of the things we'll talk about, for example, is the easiest solution. The one that is obvious isn't necessarily the right one. The one that's sitting in front of us might not actually be the right one. Have we thought through the most available being the most correct answer to our questions? So that's an example of where bias will come in and impact the way we are thinking, particularly if we don't have a lot of time to think through the conversation, and we will quickly find a solution that makes logical sense, but there could be a major flaw in one of the aspects of that decision-making process, and that would not be the right outcome. So it's just being mindful of it so that we catch ourselves and we've thought it through and come out to the right place, hopefully. Marks and Spencer's example put forward where the wrong people were influencing the organization, the fashion, the people, the advertising, all those things are an issue. Another one we've talked about is AI. Problem you've got there is if humans are designing artificial intelligence, can they therefore equally have a bias impact put into artificial intelligence? The problem you've got with decision-making done in an AI format is teaching it the human aspect. It might come up with a statistically right answer, but it actually might be the wrong answer because it's going to kill 10 people or something like that. So I've seen a couple of debates around this where artificial intelligence, at the moment, decision-making by machines, to the degree machine learning might help in time, but they risk being binary in the information it gets given and isn't able to put that human element of one thing weighs more than another part of the decision, and they're not all equal components, and therefore the wrong answer can be reached quite easily by a machine learned environment. And I know there was an example given, and I can't remember the exact detail, but in a boardroom environment where the company secretary was asked a question, and so was the machine asked the same question, And the company secretary came up with the EQ element and the answer that was more palatable for the organization and more correct for the organization than the machine that came out with what appeared to be the logical answer. But the logical answer actually could not have been carried out by the business. It wasn't feasible and practical in their environment. Peer review is a way in that medics try and avoid biased decisions. The context I've seen that in is where you have a checklist environment, so people always go through a process to make sure they get to the right outcome. In terms of socializing the content as they're working in an environment of medical unknown, I think the more you can debate, but obviously you can't debate in certain environments. If you've got people lying cut open in front of you on a little table, you can't socialize that too much. You have to go through the process of getting the job done. So there's a balance in the various environments where the process of decision making can be effective. If you're in a boardroom and you're trying to decide on an investment or whether you sell a company or what you're going to do with a project that you're working on, you might end up being able to discuss that for half an hour and even kick it down the road and go pick it up next week. But you're not going to be able to do that in certain environments where you're on a machine floor and vehicles being put together and you've got a problem and you have to have an immediate answer. So we've always got to be careful in the decision-making environment is fit for purpose. And I think that comes back to the AI point, is that sometimes speed is critical, sometimes it's not. All these things are so interplayable that to try and define a set of rules is as equally dangerous and might be the point one or two of you are making. Meetings are run to a person's agenda, absolutely. And how many times do we see and CEOs always get accused of this, but you can see it in any role that's bringing papers to the board, that they're brought at the last minute to get a quick decision so that they don't have to just risk. People will more likely go for a yes decision than they'll go for a no decision if it's about moving the business forward. The difficulty you've got is if you've got an environment where everybody, as a chairman, want 100% agreement amongst everybody on a decision, you're likely then to have difficulties getting to that single decision. So sometimes CEOs will try speed as one to try and derail those that might be reflective and try and have more of a debate around it. Also, a lot of people, when they're bringing a paper to the board or bringing some big project to the board, and don't respect their board, and their board don't get on with the executive in the way that they should, you do then find that you'll get this breakdown of communication and trust and transparency, and they will race things through the board in the hope they just get a yes decision. What does work better, and we talked about it in an earlier session, was breaking decisions up into pieces so that you can get things decided quickly, because it's one decision, not a multitude of decisions all wrapped into each other. Yep. So Daniel, as you say, there's no such thing as any right way. They are fast, they're slow. You need the combination. And certain environments, businesses, industries, situations, you need sometimes instant decisions. I mean, fight or flight. We all know that if you end up in a fight or flight environment, that is an instant reaction, and you are then going to follow that one through because that's the right thing to do. So we can't deliberate everything. And if we start deliberating everything, no business will happen at all. We'll go on forever and achieve nothing. Yes, and the point being made around survival is we are trying to survive as a world, and we are evolving as a world. And talk about if you eat and something makes you sick, avoid the berry in the future. Sometimes if you've had something that you felt it's poisoned you, you will always avoid that thing. but it might not have been that caused the problem. It could have been a set of correlated circumstances. So it's always making sure that, have you thought through why you're avoiding that food, discussion, debate, sensitivity? What is the human reaction, the cortisol reaction that we're getting in the brain to that topic at that moment in time? And it might be a collation of a number of things, not just that one thing that you're connecting it to. So once again, we're coming back to being influenced by a circumstance, and we are then correlating it to the repeat of it over and over and over again. And yes, absolutely, it is about and as I said right at the beginning, we are a function of our learning and our experiences. And sometimes that learning has got flaws in that learning. And it's making sure that we've got our own handbrake system to check that we are not flawed in some of the correlations, combinations, and responses that we are having. So all of these are correlated, and the points you're making are all valid. There was another one here that's been made about confirmation bias. That is one of the key biases that creates groupthink. Is that you see something, you say, oh, I've seen that before. Oh, that correlates to that. Somebody else repeats and we all agree. But nobody's actually sat down and said why. Why are we all agreeing? And once again, our handbrake mechanism has failed because we've ended up coming to the right decision. We think we're great. Look how quickly we made that decision. But did we actually stop and challenge our process? Did we handbrake the right spaces so that the biases didn't kick in? And the bias kicks in with one, and it has a domino impact and invariably can affect the other people in the decision-making process as well, which is what we've got to all try and avoid. Done quite a lot of talking today. Feels like I've done most of it. See if there's any questions. I think I've probably covered most of the points. But I think the most important, and the one being made here around a company secretary, and being able, the value you've got of a very competent COSEC in the environment is recognizing those influences. There's a whole chapter and lecture on the COSEC as an influencer and how they can help, being a mentor, being a coach, but equally being part of the team player, and how they can influence outcomes. Now, if you have a very competent COSEC, that is a wonderful place to be in, because they will guide the journey that the organization, people, and the board need to go through in making the decisions they need to make. The value that you've got is being able to have the, I'm going to use the word legacy knowledge, but it's the wrong word, where the company secretary has got the corporate knowledge. So they've got the holistic corporate knowledge. They know the positives and negatives from so many perspectives. And in the work that I do, one of the key people, if I do a board evaluation, I speak to one person, I could probably write the report. By the time I've spoken to everyone else and I go back to the company secretary, it all correlates. So that person invariably has got the mindset and ability to absorb all the positives, negatives, influences that are occurring, and can recognize people's biases far better than other directors might recognize it, or even a chairman might recognize it, or an executive director or a management team person might recognize these kind of behaviors as they play themselves out. COSEC's usually a pretty good one to understand when that is occurring more than it should be doing, or if at all. I hope everyone found that useful, added value. These are raced conversations, but we've got 2 more sessions on this difficult topic because we all don't believe we're biased. Clearly, we think we're above it. So it's just understanding how it does play its part in the way we live our lives and how we behave in every aspect of our business and our personal lives. And I mean, if they look at buying a car, how many times can just the color be the one that makes you decide on buying that model or not buying that model? I've heard people say, I'll never buy a red car because the football team that's opposing us in the local derby, their colors are red, and they won't therefore buy a red car. That's influence. So there's some interesting ways in which it can influence our lives. So thank you, everyone. We will put this up for viewing for everyone else to have a look at. I do appreciate your attendance. We've got a lot of people, a good number of you that joined us today, and welcome to the family of Nuggets, and we'll see you next week. Thanks, everyone. Lovely to see a lot of you again on a regular basis. It's quite rewarding from my side.